Thank you, Samir. Thank you all for being here, for inviting me, and Buna, Kale, and Nadia, and all the co-sponsors for arranging this. It's always a pleasure to come back here, and I'm happy to be here to congratulate Villanova on being ranked #1 in basketball, and I'll see you at the end of the season. We'll see what happens then. But it's been a good year for Villanova in many respects. It's not been a very good year for the Middle East, and my talk is really to try to give you a broader perspective or a context in which to try to analyze and understand what's going on in the region, and particularly the title of this panel, the Sunni-Shia divide, which I find a bit too narrow, but still it's a topic that is discussed widely in this sense all over the world, the Sunnis and Shiites. Most of us in the Middle East had never talked about Sunnis and Shiites till about 2003, actually. It was not an issue that generated a lot of discussion in day-to-day life. We know there were Sunnis, we knew there were Shiites, we knew they had some theological differences, but there wasn't ethnic cleansing, there wasn't cutting people's heads off, there wasn't millions of refugees flowing around the region until after 2003. But it is a big issue now, so this context, I think, challenges us to understand more widely and more accurately what is actually going on in our region, and what are the particular consequences for minorities, for Christians, and for all people in the region, as well as for the Arab community as a whole, the Middle Eastern communities as a whole, and the world at large. So let me first just say that minorities and Christians and all citizens in our region have been experiencing a set of developments and trends that have shaken the order that has defined the Arab world and the Middle East broadly for perhaps about 500 years. And I would say there's actually 3 broad orders that we can look at very broadly, 3 defining orders in the last 500 years. You had the Ottoman order, which for about 400 years defined much of the region, and under that order you had individual communities. We heard about them very well described yesterday. And then you had the colonial period, which varied in different countries, but somewhere between 1 and 4 generations, you had colonial powers running Arab countries. And then by the 1930s, 1940s, you started to get the modern nation state, or the modern state. They weren't really nation states, many of them. But you started to get the state, the country, with borders and central government, army, and passports, which was a novelty for most of the Arab world. And that state order came into being right after World War I and developed gradually. Even into the 1960s, states were becoming independent, and even until today, the borders of these states keep changing. Sudan, Yemen, Palestine, Kuwait disappeared briefly and came back as it should have. So these borders are very erratic and very fluid in many cases, and they're particularly fluid in the eyes of their own people. But let's remember first that we're talking about a region that in this last tumultuous century, from 1915 to 2015, has grown in population from around 25 million from about 30 million till about 400 million. An extraordinary population growth. I don't think it's been equaled in any place else in the world. And this is one of the issues that has led to some of the stresses that we're dealing with. But more importantly, within this 100-year period, this last tumultuous century, the fundamental basic concepts that define both a state and the lives of its individuals, whether they're minorities or majorities or somewhere in between, these fundamental concepts have never been either defined or validated by the people of these societies. And what I mean by these fundamental concepts that shape the lives of individuals as well as the lives of communities and states are concepts that are pretty fundamental: statehood, nationhood, sovereignty, religiosity and secularism, and identity, communal identities, national identities, individual identities, citizenship, governance, and the dignity that should come from governance that allows people to achieve their basic rights and have their fundamental human needs met: schooling, housing, education, food, water, dignity and governance. Security, people talk all the time of security and stability. We've never had the opportunity as citizens of Arab countries to actually say what is a secure society. We've never been asked, we've never had the opportunity to help shape that definition. And all of these things ultimately pouring into the single greatest concept that shapes the lives of individuals and communities and states in our region, that has never been either addressed or answered by the citizens of the region, which is the concept of legitimacy. The legitimacy of the state, the legitimacy of citizens and their rights, the legitimacies of the regional order, and the legitimacy of government and the exercise of power. So if you look back briefly, so that's a pretty broad menu of pretty important and fundamental and existential concepts that are totally undefined. And therefore, every single one of them is in flux right now. And that's why our region is in such a volatile situation. The 1970s and 80s were a pivotal turning point. Many of us in this room lived through those decades. It was a pivotal turning point because the old nationalist, Arab nationalist order started to be discredited by the '67 war, by other problems in the region, lack of good governance, lack of ability to meet citizen basic needs, and many reasons. But the old order of nationalist development was replaced by something new. But it was a pretty significant turning point where I would say we can identify a few shifts in the broad political pattern of the region, which impacts individuals, again, whether minorities or majorities or somewhere in between. And when I say somewhere in between, it's because the identity of individuals in our region, as most of you who know the region know, are fluid identities, or they're multiple identities. So I can be a Palestinian, I can be a Jordanian, I can be a Christian, I can be a member of this tribe or that clan, or somebody who's a tribal member can be a member of a tribe. You can be a member of an ethnic group. You can be a religious, identify yourself religiously. You can identify yourself politically, that you're a nationalist, that you're a progressive Democrat. So, and people shift, they identify themselves with the identity that is most logistically and practically meaningful for them at the moment that they're asked. And we see this in public opinion polling over the last 20 years, where countries, where citizens are polled and they're asked, what is your main identity? Or how do you see yourself? Are you, say, they'll ask, are you Jordanian, Muslim, Christian, lawyer, whatever, a member of a political party, Arab nationalist, member of a tribe, and they'll shift the answers over time. So somebody once would be asked, they'll say, well, I'm a member of the Bani Hassan tribe. Then another time they'll say, I'm a Jordanian. And another time they'll say, I'm a Muslim. Because they cling to the identity that most helps them achieve the rights that they have not achieved through their status as a citizen in a state, because they've never been given the chance to define either citizenship or statehood. But among this range of identities that people feel and cling to, we can see a set of changing conditions in the 1970s and 80s. The development state was replaced by the consumer state. The concept the development state was replaced by the consumer state. The ruling family and their crony capitalists, in other words, the people around Zain al-Abidin bin Ali or Hosni Mubarak or Ali Abdullah Saleh or Muammar Gaddafi or Omar Hassan al-Bashir, we can go across the region and name them, Bashar al-Assad or Hafiz al-Assad, Saddam Hussein. With these names are better known than the names of their countries in many cases. And these ruling families, with their crony capitalists, replaced the possibility that may have started to emerge of a social contract that defined how power was exercised. The concept of security replaced the concept of nationalism. And finally, the idea of a citizen was replaced by the idea of a consumer. So if you look around the Gulf in the last few months, one of the most dynamic expressions of Gulf identity was the opening of Legoland in one of the Gulf Emirates. And this was a big deal, Legoland. And it was presented as a big deal. And I remember years ago in Jordan when I was there, and I still come and go, the opening of McDonald's, and it was around the late 1980s, I think, was a national event. It was a huge deal. It was on TV. They met the political leadership. And so the concept of consumerism replaced the concept of citizenship. And then, again, in the 1990s to 2010, you had another period of shift, which impacted heavily on the status of citizens, the nature of statehood, and the relationship between the two. After the end of the Cold War, in 1990, until, say, 2010, about 2 decades, there was a period of slow degradation of the fundamental quality of life of a large number of people in our region. And I use those broad terms because it's very hard to quantify these things, but if you look at disparity, poverty, quality of education, labor force participation, productivity, almost any meaningful variable that defines both the ability of individuals to participate meaningfully in their society and live a decent life, and the ability of society to provide the opportunities for their citizens to do that, you find that in the 20 years after 1990, as the Cold War powers gradually pulled back a little bit here and there, you had a series of degradations in income, disparity, quality of life, opportunity, and other basic needs of citizens, water, access, arable land, reasonably priced food, etc., which governments had been providing and couldn't provide anymore because they basically ran out of money. And therefore, we had the uprisings emerge at the end of 2010 and 11, and then we've had the last 6 years. So what does all this mean? In fact, I would say that we have seen in the last 6 years of the uprisings, which is the focus of my my comments, but we've seen it going back over the last, I would say really the last 40, 50 years since the 1970s. The 1970s were the most significant turning point, I believe, in our lifetimes in the Arab world, when the shift from Arab nationalist developmental states to family-run, security-anchored, crony capitalist-supported consumer states. That shift in the 1970s has continued until today. And we see patterns emerging, starting back then, but very clear in the last 10 years. And the uprisings were the most significant manifestation of this widespread discontent that people felt. And it wasn't just that people were unhappy or they were poor or their income was low. What happened in the period between 2005, 2010 which sparked the uprisings, was that millions and millions of people started to feel that not only were they poor or were they underprivileged or didn't have access to the assets and comforts of the state or the opportunities of employment and other things, but that they were forever condemned to stay in that position of marginalization, poverty, vulnerability, and helplessness. That it wasn't just helplessness, it was powerlessness. It was the sense that they were never, ever going to be able to get out of this situation. And therefore they were condemned, they and their children, for generations to come, to a lifetime of marginalization, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the reasons why these uprisings happened. And the frightening thing is that most of the trends that sparked the uprising, the sense of helpless, marginalized powerlessness, and eternal marginalization and vulnerability and suffering by tens of millions of citizens, most of the trends underlying those things have gotten worse in the last 6 years. And I'll just give you one figure which is a bit startling. In the last 6 years, the population of the Arab world has increased by 54 million people, from something like 340 to about 400 million, 346 to 400 million. 54 million people have been born since 2010. So when the uprising started, the Arab world wasn't able to address the basic needs of its people. Now there's 54 million new people. We've got to feed them, house them, give them jobs, water, schooling, et cetera, healthcare. So the challenges facing us are incredible. But I will mention 10 points here. Can you tell me when I have 3 minutes left? I'll mention 10 points. This is America, so I got to give you my top 10 list of important trends that we need to acknowledge as happening in the Middle East, in the Arab world predominantly, but it also includes other parts of the region. And these trends help us understand the context in which individuals, whether they be Christian or Sunni or Kurdish or Druze or whatever they are, individuals, minorities as well as majorities, are living. And these trends are the following. The first one is state fragmentation. Many of the countries of our region are in a process of fragmentation and fragility at the edges. Their borders are pretty porous. Most Arab borders now, you can come and go as you want across them in various ways, as we've seen people doing, whether they're refugees or arms smugglers or narcotic smugglers or people just going to find a job somewhere. So the fragmentation of the state has been a steady trend for some years. The second point is related to this, is the slow, steady, but continuous contraction of the central government. This started in the 70s. We could see this in the late 70s very clearly, which is when the Muslim Brotherhood started to rise as a big regional movement after having been there since the 20s and 30s, but they became much bigger in the 1970s. Why? Because the central government wasn't able to take care of everybody's health care, education, the needs of the unemployed, et cetera, or to give voice to people in terms of their representation, politically, culturally, emotionally, nationally, whatever. So the contraction of the central government, both from physical spaces and from sectors in society. So you have sectors like delivering fresh water, communications, education, where the central government is gradually reducing its role. It's not leaving totally, but reducing its role, and that role is being filled by other people, and therefore you're getting a shared sovereignty taking place among the people who deliver these services and the government that delivers some of these services. And combined with the contraction of the government has been a renewal of authoritarian tendencies, heavily, directly, explicitly, and eagerly supported by foreign countries, including the United States, the Europeans, the Russians, the Iranians, Chinese, Turks, almost everybody, as well as powers within the Arab world like Saudi Arabia and others. So this renewed authoritarianism is heavily supported by foreign actors. The third trend is that political violence by all states and organizations has continued across the region as every single political actor uses violence as a means of expression And all major actors, governments, opposition groups, non-governmental militias and forces, foreign actors, regional powers, international powers, every single, and terror groups, every single major actor is actively involved in military force fighting and political violence and terrorism in one way or another. The fourth trend that we see is sectarian polarization, which, as I said, in its current form, in its current violent, exclusivist form, is relatively new to our region. We had incidents in the past. The Druze and the Maronites fought it out once, and the Shiites and the government in Iraq and the Kurds fought it out once or twice. But sectarian violence on a big scale has not been part of our modern history as a general rule, but it is now. And therefore, we have to try to figure out why this started and who's behind it. Iran and Saudi Arabia are presented as the two poles of this contest, and they certainly are active, but I believe it's a much more complex issue, and one of the answers is simply that the lack of citizenship exercised through the rule of law in societies governed by legitimacy of the ruling authority and the legitimacy of the state, the lack of those things has forced people to find legitimacy, services, protection, voice, and opportunity anywhere they can. And if they find it in their tribal identity, in their religious identity, in their sectarian identity, if they find it in their local football hooligan group, they will go to those groups that give them those things that they need, not as citizens, but as human beings. So these are often not ideological reactions, they're often biological reactions. People needing to get food to feed 6 kids at home, while nobody at home works, other than one son who washes dishes in a restaurant and brings home $4 a day. People who need to find food for their kids or heating oil in winter will do anything to do that, including illegal actions. And in many cases, they will join extremist groups or militant groups or whatever. So the nature of sectarian polarization and violence needs to be much better understood. The fifth trend that's related to this a little bit is that we have now a situation which is unusual in the Middle East, which is overt, explicit military and political intervention by regional powers. And that means Israel, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia primarily. Egypt is trying to get back into the game. And these powers have always played a role regionally, but they've never done it so openly and so explicitly as they are doing it today. And part of the reason is because the bigger powers have reduced some of their engagements in the region, and therefore these local regional powers have taken over. And therefore you're getting regional contests that are playing a bigger role alongside the traditional local contests, local exchanges of fighting or political tension between people, say within Iraq or within Lebanon or within a certain country. The sixth trend is, of course, the rise of terrorism and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the global war on terror, which George Bush launched. But the United States has been actively engaged in military action in this region for about 35 years, since the early 1980s, when they helped the Afghan Mujahideen fight the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And so the US has been fighting directly or indirectly for about 35 years, often with legitimate aims, often not. But over those 35 years, most of the aims of the global war on terror and the security aims that preceded it have not been met, other than preventing another attack on the US direct soil by Al-Qaeda. Most of the aims have not been met very well. Al-Qaeda has grown, ISIS is still there, the Taliban are on the move again, Egypt has a serious security problem. So there's a trend of terrorism and ISIS-Qaeda related action that is continuing, and it breeds further authoritarianism by the Arab governments supported by foreign powers, which breeds greater security challenges by terror groups. So this is a very vicious cycle. The seventh point is a broad reconfiguration of the role of the great powers, the US, the Europeans, the Russians, and particularly the re-engagement of Russia in the region today, which is quite dramatic. It's, whether you like it or you don't like it, it's very dramatic, it's quite meaningful. We'll see where it goes. And the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks are all trying to redefine how they engage politically and develop allies and strategic partners in the region. The Israelis would like to do that wherever they can, but they're not able to because they haven't solved their problem with the Palestinians. They're still widely disliked by Arab public opinion. The Israelis are disliked because of their colonial policies, while Arab governments tend to be a little more erratic in terms of how they view the Israelis. Some of them want to have relations with them, some of them quietly want them to help them secure themselves. And so there's a very complex relationship between Arab governments and Israel, but Arab public opinion is clearly critical of Israel. But Israel is, whenever it can, it tries to develop links in the region, and now the Saudis are actively engaged in a regional reassertion of their role and their power, of their interests, in a rather clumsy way in Yemen and Syria, but they're still engaged in this, and they'll learn as they go along. The eighth point is the huge flow of refugees and internally displaced people all across the region. The numbers keep growing by the millions and millions, and the impact of this remains to be seen. And of course, the refugees have an international impact. And the ninth point is the continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is the oldest and most destabilizing and radicalizing force in the Middle East, in my view. There's no doubt that the Arab-Israeli conflict, the conflict between Zionism and Arabism, that's been going on just over, depends where you think it started. If you think it started in 1897 with the idea of a Jewish state, if you think it started in the 30s or in the teens with the Balfour Declaration, in the 30s with the communal clashes in Palestine, but it's been more or less about 100 years or so that Arab nationalists and Zionist nationalists have been fighting in Palestine. And that conflict has had huge repercussions across the region. And one of the reasons, I don't have time to get into it now, one of the reasons that people rose up against their governments 6-7 years ago is because they felt that the inability of Arab governments to deal with the challenge of Zionism, either peacefully or militarily, was one of the reasons why these Arab governments started to lose legitimacy in the eyes of their own people. And the 10th point is, all of these trends are happening while fundamental daily life conditions for individual citizens, for probably 3/4 of the 400 million Arab people, daily life conditions are getting more and more difficult. And again, quantifying this is tricky, but it's important to note something like about 65% of new entrants to the labor market in Egypt every year are going into the informal labor market. They're unqualified to do anything other than sweep floors or wash dishes or clean somebody's car. And these are the people whose families get into eternal and perpetual poverty and helplessness, and which spills over into political impact. About 45% of Arab primary and secondary school students are not learning anything in school. They do not meet basic minimum reading, writing, and numeracy tests. They cannot read and write and do basic math. They are going to drop out of school. 25 million young Arabs are out of school who should be in school. There's about 75 million in school, primary and secondary, and about 25 who should be but are not. And of the ones in school, about 50% are not learning anything. And so we have a huge structural problem inside the Arab world in terms of capturing the human capabilities that are enormous in our region, but that have been driven into the ground by the problem of authoritarian government and mismanagement. And all of these trends, including things like water problems, energy problems, electricity, all of them are trends that affect every Arab citizen, Christians, Muslims, anybody else. And that's why it's important to see this in a wider context. And people will turn back to their religion or their tribal or their ethnic identity, if you're a Circassian or a Kurd or a Druze or a Maronite or whatever you may be, you will go back to find protection in that identity if the state is treating you with these trends as it has in the past 40 or 50 years or so. So the answer to vulnerable minorities and Christians in peril is genuine citizenship in the Arab world, a clear understanding of the need for citizens to define and validate their own government systems, their own countries, their own power structures, their own national values. Tunisia is the first country to start on this road, and hopefully it'll break through and succeed, and hopefully Tunisia will prove to be the Poland of the Arab world, and that Poland broke through in the early 80s, and 10 years later the whole Soviet system collapsed, to most of it. And democratic transformation started to happen in Europe, and hopefully we'll get something similar in our region. So that context, I think, is important to understand, both for the special stresses on minorities, but also for citizens as a whole in our countries. Thank you very much.